We're getting very close to the start of our first panel with this slide. So once again, I'm Jesse Kharbanda, the Executive Director of the Hoosier Environmental Council, and what I want to do is very briefly provide a big picture assessment of Indiana solar this year and looking ahead to next year. The first thing to note is that the energy landscape is really changing in Indiana. At the start of the last decade, almost 80% of Indiana's electricity came from coal. Fast forward a decade, it's less than 50%, a massive change in just such a short period of time. Now, why is that the case? There are many drivers of change. One is the aging nature of coal plants. Once these coal plants have hit 40 or 45 or 50 years, it's time for them to retire. That's a driver. The second is phenomenal environmental advocacy campaigns in our state, such as by Indiana Beyond Coal and Citizens Action Coalition, Valley Watch, and by an array of other groups across our country. Federal policy being durable even in the face of aggressive litigation. And finally, changing economics, not just the fact that it's become more and more costly to operate coal plants, but that renewables has become cheaper. And we say that very clearly in the next slide. There's been a 70% drop plus in the last decade for both utility scale solar and rooftop solar. And what that's resulted in the case of utility scale solar, is that it's meeting and oftentimes beating conventional generation. And it's resulting in these pretty phenomenal announcements that the largest utility scale solar farm in the United States of America is going to be built in none other than Indiana, in particular in Stark and Pulaski, as they say up there, Pulaski County. If we zoom out a bit to talk about solar farms, by the end of this decade, we could have 8,500 megawatts more of utility scale solar in our state. That's more than 8 times the entire existing capacity of solar farms in Indiana. 33 projects plus are underway in 22 counties across Indiana. And the average size of these projects, 229 megawatts, orders of magnitude more than the Indianapolis Airport's solar farm, which just shows you just the massive size of it. Another thing that shows the massive size of these projects is that the average size of them is 2,400 acres. All in all, if all these solar projects get built in Indiana, they will be the size of the entire Indiana State Park system. That's the kind of footprint we're talking about solar farms. Now, rooftop solar in Indiana is not growing at nearly the clip as utility scale solar, but we see inspiring projects. In 2021, up in Walkerton, Indiana, they put in this solar field at a school. Going south to Whitestown, you see a solar array that's going to look something like this. It's not yet been built, but it's going to look something like this. So these are inspiring stories with respect to solar farms and with respect to rooftop solar. But the fact of the matter is we are facing headwinds for solar in 2022 in Indiana. One question is, will rooftop solar policy be undermined or will it be strengthened? That's a question that Ben's presentation is really going to speak to. And John's presentation also will touch upon how do we build the coalition so that we don't see rooftop solar policy get undermined. The second big question that we're facing that gets to this point of there being headwinds for solar in Indiana is, will environmentally friendly solar farm policy be undermined or will it be preserved? This gets to the question of whether the state government will weaken the ability for county governments to enact environmentally friendly solar ordinances or pollinator friendly solar ordinances. Before I introduce our panelists, just a quick point of personal privilege, because as some of you know, this is my final Greening the State House as Executive Director. And therefore, it's my final panel, policy panel that I'm moderating. And I want to simply express my great appreciation for the array of organizations in Indiana that work to advance solar, utility scale solar and rooftop solar. It is amazing that for all the adversity in Indiana, we have so many fantastic groups that are working to advance both of these causes. I also want to recognize some of my longstanding resilient colleagues. I could spend a few hours listing out all the great array of people who are working in this space, but I want to give some brief recognition to some individuals here who have had a real personal impact in my own solar advocacy efforts over the years. Laura Arnold, for really making me appreciate that the distributed generation paradigm is a paradigm, and it is one that we ought to go to for many different reasons. Kerwin Olson, for his helping me to really appreciate that there are many different avenues by which to make change in solar through the Indiana utility regulatory process. There's so many different cases by which one can pursue to make change. Denise Abdul Rahman, who has done a phenomenal job in expanding the tent of solar advocates to include people of color. Mike Mullet, for making me appreciate that language matters and that one or two words in a piece of legislation or in a rulemaking can make a profound difference in how the public policy actually impacts everyday people. Jody Paris, for being very instructive in how to build broad, inclusive coalitions. Daryl Bogus, Leslie Webb, and Barry Kastner, and Ray Wilson, for being people who are engineers by training and also have a deep heart for climate action, and having that combination be so effective in marshaling new people to support solar energy. And then Mady Hirschland and Wyatt Watkins for really teaching me about the art of effective organizing among the faith-based community, who are a sleeping giant in terms of their ability to really change the dynamic for environmental sustainability in Indiana. So these are among several people that I could recognize, but I did want to have that point of privilege before we get to the other panelists here. So our panelists for this particular one are Ben Inskeep of EQ Research, John Delurey with Vote Solar, and Jesse Wyatt of the Great Plains Institute. And what I hope you will get from listening to these great experts is the following: that you feel empowered with knowledge about rooftop solar policy in Indiana through Ben's presentation, that you are motivated to know that big tent pro-rooftop solar coalitions can succeed through John's presentation, and that you feel very informed about why environmentally sensitive solar design matters from Jesse Wyatt's presentation. So with that, I am going to turn this over to Ben Inskeep of EQ Research. Just bear with me 1 second.
Thank you for that warm introduction, Jesse. Am I coming in loud and clear? I hope so. And I think my PowerPoint is being loaded as I speak. So thank you very much. Appreciate you having me today. I'll be talking about distributed solar in Indiana. My name is Ben Inskeep. I work at EQ Research, and I'm an analyst there. Just very quickly, introduction to who I am and where I work. EQ Research is a North Carolina-based clean energy policy consulting firm. It's headquartered down in North Carolina. However, I live in Indianapolis, and I'm a Hoosier. Our expertise is in clean and distributed renewable energy, and our focus is state-level policy. We do both subscription-based policy tracking services and customized research and analysis. All right, with that introduction out of the way, let's talk about distributed solar. Now, when I'm talking about distributed solar, I'm talking about actually several different types of solar. So I want to be clear. Probably one of the things we're most familiar with are things like rooftop solar panels. And that definitely is distributed solar, but it's much, much more. It's also commercial and industrial scale solar development. So this picture here is of a Mickey Mouse themed solar array down at Disney World. There's also solar at nonprofits, governments, schools, and houses of worship. You see here a picture of a cross-shaped solar array at an Illinois church. And then there's also community solar, which really expands the availability of solar and access to the benefits of solar, as I'll get into it a little bit in my presentation later. What I really want to focus a lot of the presentation on today is this issue of what happens when you, as the distributed solar customer, generate energy and you're generating more energy than you need at any particular moment in time. Say in a really sunny afternoon, you're using some of that energy, but you're putting some of that extra energy you generate onto the grid and sharing that with your neighbors, who can then use that energy to power their homes and businesses. So you see that with that orange arrow here going to the grid. That's the big question that is facing us in terms of policy in the 2022 legislative session and before the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission right now. What's happening is a big change to how we're valuing rooftop solar credits and other distributed generation that is provided back to the grid. The policy we've had in place in Indiana for the past 17 years or so is called net metering. And net metering lets you, for every 1 kilowatt hour you put on the grid, it lets you take 1 kilowatt hour back off the grid at a different moment in time. An equal trade, 1-for-1 equal trade, and there's no additional cost for for taking energy off the grid relative to putting a unit of energy onto the grid. So it's very intuitive, and it's a very commonplace policy. Now, Senate Enrolled Act 309 in 2017 set in motion changes to that policy. It said that by July 1st of 2022, so this next year, net metering is going to be replaced with what is called excess distributed generation rates or tariffs. And that is a bit of a mouthful, but those EDG rates are really important. And I'm going to get into some of the nitty-gritty weeds because this is such a critical issue facing environmentalists and everybody who wants renewable energy in Indiana to power our homes and businesses in our grid. Now, the issue is that this EDG rate is a credit that is much, much lower than what you would get currently under net metering. In fact, utilities, the proposals right now would apply this new EDG rate to every piece of energy you put onto the grid. Any unit of energy that touches the grid that you generate and that you give to the utility to share with your neighbors is going to be credited at this very low rate. The rate is between 2.5 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, compare that to net metering, where your effective credits that you're getting for energy that you provide to the grid are more in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 cents per kilowatt hour. So definitely, 3 to 5 times higher than this new EDG rate. Now, advocates have been pushing back on these proposals. Particularly, they are asking the IURC to continue the policy of monthly netting under this new EDG rate paradigm. Now, if we continue the policy of monthly netting, it would effectively allow you to continue to share your extra energy with the grid during your billing month and take energy off the grid during that billing month at an equal 1-to-1 offsetting rate. At the end of that billing month, then any extra energy that you have sent to the grid that's accumulated that you haven't used or haven't had to use those credits to yourself, that would then be turned into that EDG rate. So you would, experience that reduced financial benefit at the end of the month for any extra energy, but you would still retain much of the benefits that we have under net metering by allowing this policy of monthly netting to continue. It's important to note that this utility proposal would really discourage rooftop solar adoption by Hoosiers, and so it's unfair to customers and would really put solar out of reach for lower and middle class Hoosiers. It would really make solar only viable to the very wealthiest of Hoosiers who are not sensitive about making a return on their investment when it comes to installing rooftop solar. It's also important to note that one utility has already put in place this very destructive no netting policy that the other utilities are trying to put in place now. So if you're in Evansville and your utility is CenterPoint, formerly known as Vectren, you already have lost out on the ability to net meter a new solar system. And so you're already subjected to this new policy paradigm. I want to highlight again that the key difference between net metering and monthly netting that's being proposed in these cases is that net metering, you can continue using these credits, these 1-to-1 offsets indefinitely. From month to month, any kilowatt hour credits you have banked. You can continue to offset future usage in future months at that 1-to-1 rate. Whereas under monthly netting, that rate would step down for any extra energy you've generated over a billing period time. Contrast both of those policies then to that no netting proposal that our 4 other investor-owned utilities are proposing. That's Duke Energy, IPL, or now AES Indiana, Indiana Michigan Power, and NIPSCO up in northern Indiana. So under that proposal, anytime you send energy to the grid, even for 1 minute, for 1 hour, for 1 day, all of that energy would then be credited at this very low rate, 2 to 3 cents. In contrast to that existing policy, again, 10 to 15 cents per kilowatt hour. So that's a very dramatic reduction, and that would really undermine that economic value proposition for a new customer that wants to pursue solar. How bad are we talking? Well, you can see here the different utility proposals and that difference between what that retail rate credit is for a residential customer versus what this new EDG credit rate would be for that customer. We're talking about a 72 to 81% drop in that credit value. Again, that's happening July 1st for systems installed after July 1st, 2022, or for systems installed right now if you're in the Vectren or CenterPoint service territory. How would this specifically change your payback period if you're thinking about investing in rooftop solar? Well, under net metering, you have a pretty reasonable payback period right now. We're talking about 10 to 15 years on average, oftentimes even less. If you're able to get a pretty good deal on your solar panels, you might be able to do it for under 10-year payback period. Contrast that with this proposal for no netting that the utilities would like to see. That would push out that payback period to a period of 25 to 30 years. And that's really a significant time frame, both just because it's long, but also because your assumed life for your solar panels are probably going to be in the range of 25 to 30 years. So you're talking about maybe not even being able to make back your initial investment costs, let alone get a return on it under this new kind of policy paradigm. If this no netting EDG rate is adopted by the IURC, it would really dramatically undercut that financial benefit. It's important to note that net metering and monthly netting are very common policies. It is the predominant policy across the United States. 39 states currently require their investor-owned utilities to offer monthly netting or net metering to residential and small commercial customers. So we're not talking about any sort of radical policy here. We're talking about what is the mainstream policy across the country, and Indiana really taking steps to move away from that abruptly. It's also important to note that this is not a liberal or conservative issue. Both liberal and conservative so-called states have monthly netting in place and have reinforced that is a sound and just policy. Recent examples of states adopting monthly netting or upholding that policy include states like Iowa, South Carolina, Georgia, Arkansas, and Kentucky. I've highlighted here one interesting example from Kentucky that we've seen just this year, where the utilities there, just like in Indiana, they proposed this no netting type of rate idea. The commission there struck that down and said, that's not reasonable. We're going to continue monthly netting, just like under net metering. And we're going to apply a new EDG credit rate at the end of that billing month to any extra energy you've accumulated over the month that you've sent to the grid. And when that commission tallied up the benefits, they quantified the benefits and tallied them up, they found that that rate should be closer to 10 cents per kilowatt hour. Contrast that to what our utilities just north of the border in Indiana are saying is the rate. That's 2.5 to 3 cents. So a really big discrepancy. You can really see that in this slide here, where you see that our neighboring states have a credit rate for solar that is sent to the grid that is on the in the neighborhood of about 4 times higher than what would be the rate in Indiana if these utility no netting proposals are adopted by our Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission. And I think a lot of folks are really worried. Not only will it mean that a lot of folks can't make the economics of solar work anymore, but it would also mean a lot of our installers in Indiana are going to be forced to look to our neighboring states to advance their businesses. There's not going to be a strong incentive or value proposition to sell solar to customers in Indiana when you can just go across the border in any direction and be able to offer customers a benefit that's 4 times larger. It's important to note then that this is why the policy of continuing monthly netting is really important. If we have monthly netting and we retain monthly netting, it would really put us on par with our neighboring states and would not make us outliers like we're poised to be right now. In closing, I wanted to touch on 3 additional policies. I really focused on this financial value proposition and what are the economics, the economic benefit you get from solar and providing and sharing energy to the grid. There's a few other barriers that I wanted just to touch on briefly. The first is related to community solar. There's a lot of Hoosiers that just can't put solar on top of the roofs, maybe because they're renters, maybe their roof is old, maybe they have shading, and they still want to benefit from and get access to solar energy. So community solar is a really cool way to do that. That would allow customers to subscribe to a portion of a ground-mounted solar facility located nearby in their community on the distribution grid. And they would be able to receive credits on their utility bill for that portion of that solar that they're subscribed to. So it actually offers them a chance to save money on their energy bill while also contributing to and investing in beneficial distributed solar. So we need legislation in Indiana in order to authorize this and tell our utilities, hey, you have to fairly credit customers on their bill for community solar billing credits, because right now they're not required to do so. The next policy that I'll briefly touch on is expanding financing options to solar. Right now, solar customers are not allowed to buy solar energy from a solar company. They can buy a solar system, they can put the panels on the roof, but a solar company can't invest in the solar panels themselves and sell that energy to a customer. Now, the reason why we would want something like that, called a power purchase agreement, is twofold. First of all, it will help address that barrier of that upfront cost. Solar panels can be costly if you're buying them upfront, because that benefit you're going to receive is over the next 25 to 30 years. So by being able to finance it through a power purchase agreement, you no longer have to pay for that cost upfront, and instead you can just pay for that power you buy from the from that provider. The second barrier that it would help to address is the fact that a lot of entities that don't have a tax liability, think your church, your school, your government building, nonprofits, they currently can't benefit from that 26% federal investment tax credit. So under a third-party power purchase agreement, this type of solar financing arrangement, that solar company can actually utilize that tax credit and pass on those savings to these types of customers that otherwise wouldn't be able to do so. And then finally, I wanted to note that there are a lot of homeowners associations in Indiana. These are those entities that if you're joining us, if you're moving into a subdivision or a condo or another kind of planned development, you automatically become a member of this type of entity. You have to pay homeowners association dues, and then the homeowners association can tell you rules about what you can do with your property. Unfortunately, some of those rules include prohibitions on rooftop solar. And so we've actually seen about 400 HOAs in central Indiana create these kind of barriers within those rules. And so that has really prevented a lot of folks from being able to install rooftop solar on their roofs. In closing, I want to encourage you to take action. So first of all, now is a great time to consider putting solar on your own roof. If you are a homeowner, if you have a roof that would be well suited for solar, there isn't really a better time than right now because of these policy changes coming down the line. It could be much worse financially for you to pursue solar after July 2022. And then the second point is to please contact your state senator and representative. Now is the time to let them know you support solar policies, particularly for distributed solar like net metering and monthly netting. Those are really critical to continuing to build our vibrant solar community in Indiana. And then also let them know you support expanding access to solar to customers and other Hoosiers through things like community solar programs, clarifying the legality of things like solar financing arrangements, particularly power purchase agreements, and preventing unfair bans on solar by homeowners associations. And again, now is really the critical time to act. We are gearing up right now for that legislative session. Bills are being drafted. Lawmakers are considering their positions, and it's a short session. So there's only a couple months to get stuff done. Thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions you have.
Thank you so much, Ben. Really informative presentation about two incredibly important topics, the whole issue of no netting and the implications, the broader implications of eliminating net metering. We do have a couple of great questions that have come in, but I think what we'll do, because it will provide the benefit of others on our panel from weighing in, we'll save all of them to a general Q&A to the end. So if folks could please be sure to put your questions in the stage comments, that would be fantastic. So thank you so much, Ben, and we'll put up John here in a second, who will do our next presentation. All right, John.
All right. Thanks, Jesse, for the transition there, and thanks, Ben, for the expertise, as always. I'm going to share my screen and bring you all on a little tour of the Midwest in hopes of sharing some stories of hope about what might come next, what is possible in a fractured political climate, and especially what's possible by reaching across aisles and building a big tent with broad appeal. So quickly, just some background on who we are. I promise we're not as fun as we look. We're a bunch of solar nerds, and we're spread out across the country, based in 6 different regions. We have a strong focus on equity, access, and justice. And I like to say that our goal is climate justice, and our journey and our vehicle is with solar. We focus on state level legislative and regulatory work. So we often work to fight for strong legislation or good solar bills, and then track those through the implementation, through the regulatory process, to try to get that full picture of what's going well and what could use some improvement. And we have some active legislative campaigns in Michigan, Minnesota, and Illinois. And I'll be drawing on those 3 states to paint this picture of what can happen when the right stars align and when we force those stars to align. So I wanted to lead things off by just reminding us all that renewable energy consistently pulls higher than it should. It's an overwhelming majority of both parties that support this rapid deployment of renewable energy. And it is genuinely a bipartisan topic in probably one of the most partisan times of our country's history. It can draw support from obviously across both spectrums of the political landscape, but even within the conservative or Republican side of the landscape, you have off-grid, conservative Republicans, and like aligning with some anti-monopoly, almost libertarian style advocates, and just fiscal conservatives who are interested in saving some money and making a sound investment in their future and in their pocketbooks. So it does create this broad tent for a lot of people all moving in the right direction. So to dig a little deeper and to provide some background into what that actually looks like. I mean, if you look at polling data like this, there are no issues that have this type of broad spectrum appeal. So even conservative Republicans, for example, more of them would like to develop alternative energy than support expanding fossil fuels. And so obviously when you look at Democrats and those that lean Democratic, it's even a stronger skew in the direction of developing alternatives. But this does start to paint that picture of people are watching this closely. They're excited about what might lie ahead. Specifically, solar and wind do really, really well. Solar panels, and this is, across parties, this is a representative sample of Americans. they favor having more solar panel farms. And wind turbines poll slightly worse, but still way up there. And I have a few theories about why this is. Like, we live in an age of technology. Technology is more exciting than commodities. And I think people see solar, they see wind, and it just excites them. It's something that they want to learn more about. It's something that maybe they've thought about or heard about, but seemed like some sort of futuristic tech that was reserved for the space stations. And it's now here, and it's, on their neighbor's house, and it's something tangible and something that you can see. Unlike with coal or with fracking, where it's far away and people know it's destructive in their mind's eye, but they never really see those detriments or those benefits. So there's a lot of different reasons, but just wanted to emphasize that this is truly like a groundswell movement in support of renewable energy technology. I'm going to add one layer of nuance here, because I think it's helpful as you all embark to pursue these broad spectrum campaigns. The graph, or the chart on the left, is among Republicans, or those that lean Republican, and it breaks it down by generation. So as you can see, there is a significant difference between older folks who lean Republican or are Republican, and younger, those who identify as millennials and younger. And so that will eventually lead to change alongside a bunch of other factors. But as you're doing that outreach, it's worth keeping an eye on who might be more receptive to this messaging and to this future we're trying to build. And then here's a little pinch of sobering news to round things out and to ensure that we're taking advantage of this moment. I've been a little apprehensive for some time now that eventually the messaging machine will start to take a toll on renewable energy. And so if you see in that chart on the right, there is this dip over the last couple of years, not surprisingly aligned with a contentious election and increased partisanship, but there is a bit of a dip in Republicans that support it. And so, 73% in support of solar panels is still a huge number. Again, there's nothing like this, but that some of that support might be starting to wane. And my two takeaways there are act fast and counteract that. So take advantage of this opportunity while we have it, but also tell the right stories, build narratives, help Republicans understand those local tangible benefits. And for example, Jesse was talking about the benefits of utility scale solar and everything that we might see in Indiana in the foreseeable future. Understanding how that might contribute to the bottom line of farmers who might be leasing their land, or how many teachers a utility scale solar farm, just the taxes on that could support. These are the things that people will actually be thinking about and could overpower this knee-jerk opposition that is being ginned up by the national partisan messaging machines. So I'm going to pivot to talking about a few states and trying to make this feel more real, and also to show that there is opportunity, even in states that might lean partisan or might lean in a conservative direction, that there's opportunity to advance solar and advance renewable energy. So for some political context, Minnesota is actually the only state in the country with a split legislature. The Senate is controlled by Republicans. The House is controlled by the Democrat Farmer Labor Party, which is the Minnesota version of Democrats, and terrific branding, I might add. Democratic governor, and it's a somewhat politically competitive state. I know most states aren't, but I just add that because it might influence the way legislators think, that some of their districts might be more competitive. Leadership of one chamber or the other might be a little competitive. So it does allow more room for political victories like this, but it's only a small piece of the overall puzzle. So I would say Minnesota had the most prolific and productive spring session of anywhere in the country when it comes to renewable energy and climate change. They passed a series of provisions, many enclosed in a broader like omnibus funding package, but some split out and worthy of their own case studies. So the ECO Act, I'll mention first, it really represented a significant expansion, both of dollars and of scope, of existing energy efficiency programs with a strong focus on serving low-income Minnesotans. Within that omnibus package, there was an expansion of an existing rooftop solar incentive program, more funding, more years to that program. And one of the programs that I'll focus in on, a new program to incentivize solar schools. So some additional supplemental funding to help make that decision for public schools even easier to go solar and to weave that curriculum into their lesson planning to see the benefits and the savings that come from solar. So I'll talk a little bit about both. And first, I'll just mention that the ECO Act, which, name aside, was a huge victory for climate change and energy conservation. Passed out of the Senate with 25 of 34 senators on the Republican side. So it wasn't just one or two Republicans that switched teams to support something that they felt they had to. It was a genuine bipartisan movement. And I can't think of where else we've seen something like that. It needed Senate support to pass, or needed Republican support to pass the Senate, and it got it. And I'll explain why in just a little bit here. On the solar rewards and the solar school program, it was a slightly different path to success. Again, this was folded into this bigger funding package. And so it had a lower bar. Really, like, the ideas were generated by Democrat champions and sponsors, and it just couldn't be opposed or seen as contradictory enough to be fought out by Republicans during negotiations. And solar schools in particular had significant bipartisan support. And again, I'll tease it out in just a second. So first, just want to highlight this quote from the Republican sponsor. And this, I think it underlines a couple key takeaways that I want to bring out. One is, it's so important to have leadership from both sides of the aisle. You can trust that different Republicans and different Democrats have different amounts of power in the state house. And so the ability to nudge them in the right direction by showing that the leaders, those that they take their marching orders from, are supportive, it goes a long way. And so again, like, you have Republican messaging woven into this quote, but ultimately it's about energy efficiency. It's about innovative policy change. And then this is actually about the solar schools program. And I just wanted to highlight that it's a really compelling message. We often get bogged down in the very complex policies of solar or wind or renewables, and sometimes forget how important a narrative becomes. And so with schools, you had students, teachers, administrators, labor unions, clean energy advocates, clean energy industries, all aligned to support this package that, again, wasn't seen as too controversial by the Republicans. I couldn't find any photos before the presentation today, but we had students who had made signs in support of this. We had students share their testimony through LTEs, letters to the editor. It's just a really compelling narrative, even though it's not huge numbers of like megawatts, even though we're not adding a ton of renewables to the board. So now for Illinois, and I suspect I know what you all are thinking. It is a very different landscape. It's Democratic supermajorities in both chambers. It's a Democratic governor, but there is a strong geographic divide between more urban Democrats and rural Republicans. So Not trying to suggest that this is an apples to apples comparison with Indiana, but there are some lessons that I think cross the state border. One is that Republicans can see the tangible benefits of energy infrastructure. I remember some of the final, hearings and testimony on the House or the Senate floor. Republicans stood up and they would say, like, I have more solar or wind than any of you Democrats or anybody else in this body. And they also hear and see about the benefits that come from that, whether it's tax revenue or support to individual landowners. So they can see and feel those benefits. Another key lesson here is about power mapping, which is like organizing parlance for understand who can give you what you want and what they need to make the right decision. So what motivates them? What makes them tick? We knew that there were a number of Republican members who would care deeply about some of the energy infrastructure in their district, or would really want to see a coal to solar program that emerged from this massive climate package called the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. Or they care deeply about just transition and ensuring that fossil workers have jobs in the clean energy future. So doing that power mapping, understanding the potential opposition, and overcoming it is going to be a key piece of the puzzle. Now to Michigan, which might offer the closest proxy, where you have a Republican majority in both chambers, a Democratic governor, and a slight amount of competitiveness just due to independent redistricting that could change the political formula in the state. But ultimately, it is Republican-run state house and a fairly conservative body at that. While there aren't specific immediate victories to point to, there are key steps being taken in the right direction. So there are two bills moving forward in Michigan. One is to support third-party owned community solar. So, and Ben provided a really helpful overview of that in his presentation. And there's another that is really just trying to do some damage control on a really harmful constraint that we like to call the solar cap. And this solar cap, it's a limit on how many rooftop solar systems the utilities are required to accept. So importantly, and to hark back to Ben's comments, it's not a net metering cap. It's a cap on solar, on rooftop solar. And for my energy nerds who are listening, they would still have to accept it just from PURPA. Like they couldn't refuse interconnection, but it is one of the most onerous solar policies in the nation. And this bill would eliminate that cap. Utilities are opposed to both bills, and utility influence isn't just on Republicans. Plenty of Democrats owe a lot of their campaign fundraising to utility contributions or assistance in other ways. And I will say, like, we saw the community solar bill just recently introduced. It had both Democrats and Republicans speaking strongly in favor of this. It's been a challenge because the head of the main energy committee is a Republican who receives a lot of utility funding. And so some of the energy utilities are trying to kill both bills, and frankly, it matters less about which side of the aisle you're on. It's more about how beholden you are to the utilities in a state like Michigan. I feel like this quote really underlines that. So this is the Republican sponsor of the solar cap bill. And it's in support of community solar, it's in support of rooftop solar. And at the end there, he says, I want to see increased public pressure on consumers' energy and DTE and the Energy Committee, which is run by that roadblock Republican member that I just mentioned, as well, because that's what it's going to take to move this forward. And so, it's clear as day that neutralizing utilities and shaking them out of the picture is going to make or break a lot of important legislation. So I'm going to wrap things up with just a few key takeaways. One is that thing I mentioned earlier around power mapping. Understand what influences key legislators. Come to understand their district, meet with them. If you are a constituent, go and have coffee with them or try to establish yourself as a core constituent or a connected member of the community. 2, secure support from legislative leadership. Others tend to follow. They can't track and know everything. And so having a few core messengers, those that are trusted on both sides of the aisle, is going to allow a lot of other members to eventually support this. 3 is neutralize utility opposition. I did just want to highlight one additional point under this. In Illinois, we were going to get a pretty good energy bill almost no matter what, just because of the politics. We wouldn't have done as well as we did, right? This bill that just passed is one of the most comprehensive, almost certainly the most equitable climate and energy bill in the country. And that wouldn't have happened if utilities were at the table. And they essentially neutralized themselves through a series of corruption scandals, through being a little too public in the way they bought legislators or bought influence. Look for that. Use it. If utilities are not playing by the rules, or if they're not there to support like a fair democratic process, consider starting to use that in some of the messaging, and that might help neutralize that opposition. 4, build compelling narratives and diverse coalitions. Pull a lot of different people together. It takes a big tent. So if you remember from those solar schools, like start to understand what is going to pull a lot of different stakeholders to the same table. And then 5 is start now. In Minnesota, those bills had been introduced every year for the last few years, and they didn't have the steam that it took to pass until they did. And so start now. It does take some time to build bipartisan support. So I'm going to wrap up. Here's some of my contact information. And I'll also add that this massive, beautiful solar project is in Arkansas. And I suspect they'd give Indiana a run for their money in terms of partisan lean. So just as a reminder, like solar is inevitable, both because technology gets cheaper and fuel gets more expensive. And on a more sober note, because the climate crisis will continue to intensify. And so it's going to happen. And it's just a matter of how quickly can we make it happen, and what can we do to help it happen in a bigger way and in a quicker way. So I'll wrap up there. Thanks so much for listening, and look forward to questions at the tail end here.
Jesse, you are live, so please go ahead, and I'll remove myself from screen. Thank you so much, John. We look forward to answering all the questions that we've been getting in the chat just as soon as Jesse's wrapped up here.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Ben and John, for setting this awesome precedent and getting the conversation around solar started today. I'm really excited to be here talking about designing solar for environmental benefits. A little background about me. My name is Jesse Wyatt. I'm currently a senior research analyst with an organization called the Great Plains Institute. We are a nonprofit based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, but we work pretty extensively across the Midwest and actually the country to transform the energy system. And we do that in a lot of different ways. But what's probably most pertinent to our conversation today is a large body of our work that focuses on strategic outreach with local communities, specifically for utility scale renewable energy deployment. What does that mean? So we will work with and help communities prepare long-term planning efforts and integrate wind and solar market development into those long-term planning efforts. So just like John was saying, we understand sort of the inevitability of renewable energy systems coming to communities. So how can we help communities get ahead of that and make sure that as projects are built and developed, it's being done in a way such that it aligns with community values? We also participate in and help facilitate community dialogue around future energy system needs and the opportunities for some of those energy systems. And finally, we work to investigate some of these energy system co-benefits or benefits in general, and how we can optimize those. And that includes environmentally sensitive design best practices. I say that in a slightly different tone because that concept is going to be really important to the conversation that I have with you all today. So before I dive into environmentally sensitive design and some really beautiful photos of solar with vegetation underneath, I wanted to provide some scales for what we're talking about. So as Ben helped describe and John did as well, there's sort of these two camps of solar. You have your small or community scale, which is going to range from rooftop to community scale. On the landscape, that looks like 5 to 20 acres in size. And it's similar for maybe those who struggle to visualize what an acre is to like a rural residence in rural areas. And those, for context, can be permitted by right in certain areas or through conditional use permit. And that context is going to be important later on. In contrast, what we're focusing on is that large scale or utility scale solar. So this is where the primary function of solar on the landscape is energy generation. These project sizes are going to range from hundreds to even thousands of acres, so quite large by comparison. They're frequently going to involve multiple property owners due to the size, and they're permitted through conditional use permits where allowed. There are some inherent benefits of solar. I know John touched on this. So regardless of how the site is prepared, you're going to see with the arrival of solar in your community, economic development. That's largely going to come in the form of the creation of local jobs and increased spending. You'll see increased local property tax income. And what's really unique about that, or what creates a lot of incentive for local communities to have that property tax appetite, is that it can be utilized for things like schools, public safety, and that's all without creating additional service needs, which just means that, in very frank language, the solar kind of just sits. It doesn't require anything of the community to operate, but it's all the while generating that property tax income. You'll see local power generation. And so as we think about transition away from a fossil-dependent energy system, you're also going to see the benefit of having proximity to those carbon-free electricity sources through solar. So there's no shipping, no purchasing of fuels that need to be brought to the community. That generation is happening right there. And finally, the reduction of environmental risk. So we know that as coal plants come offline, as solar becomes an increasingly viable and ubiquitous opportunity for electricity production, you're seeing on the flip side of that coin, reduction in things like mining, pipelines, reduction in coal ash, mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, because we know there's no tailpipe at the solar farm, as well as reduction in things like mercury and other air toxics. However, those benefits may be inherent to solar. What we've seen historically is that the deployment of solar energy has followed or adopted what you can call an industrial energy system model. So developers have been highly incentivized and motivated to standardize these projects to maximize energy production and reduce the cost of operation and maintenance, increase efficiency, largely without consideration for the type of impact that design practice might have on local communities, or missed opportunity for integrating additional benefits into the site design. So here you see, the intent of this historic model has been standardize and maximize efficiency, minimize cost of construction, and the cost has been the loss of that opportunity, as well as poor consideration for community and land use implications. And unfortunately, as some may be more intimately familiar with than others, the result of that lack of community consideration at the onset is pretty easy fuel to stoke some of these anti-solar sentiments, right? So communities who feel like solar has come to their community, we know it's an inevitable development as the energy system economics just makes so much sense. Yet the solar is arriving and they feel largely unprepared, right? It's there, it looks how it does, and what does that mean? Fortunately, that is no longer, or is transitioning away from being the norm, and that's largely through the application of something called environmentally sensitive design. And so ESD, as I'll refer to it, provides this way to align solar design principles with some of these local community goals and values. So it's a really broad-reaching opportunity to apply values that are important to the community. A tangible way to kind of grasp what that's saying is you might have a community who in their comprehensive plan has really really exciting environmental conservation goals, be that habitat, be that, additional pollinator habitat or other habitat for flora and fauna. That community could easily utilize these ESD principles to make a solar installation work like a meadow or a native habitat. So instead of seeing a solar farm solely as an efficient energy production system or the industrial system, they can see it as an ecosystem, right? And solar will play a role in that ecosystem. There are a lot of specific and not mutually exclusive benefits that you can pair with solar and bring to the community through ESD. I'll walk through these briefly. And like I said, it's sort of the sky's the limit when it comes to being really creative in how we design these systems so that there are these multiple benefits. You can implement habitat. So that might be the pretty ubiquitous pollinator habitat that folks like to see under solar. Not only is it aesthetically pleasing, right? Everyone loves wildflowers, but it also can provide a really important habitat for small mammals, birds, reptiles, rodents. And then there are also going to be the tertiary benefits associated with that ecosystem approach, right? In addition, there's a growing movement to repurpose land uses that have historically been contaminated. So those are referred to as brownfields. And that might be a site where other forms of development aren't accessible. You aren't going to put a house on a contaminated waste site, but you can put solar. And then you also have an opportunity when you're doing so to integrate some of these other design elements like that vegetation, that pollinator habitat, to make that site that would have probably otherwise laid fallow, not only generate income to the community, generate carbon-free electricity, but now it also has this ecosystem and environmental component as well. The next three are tapping into the water benefits that solar can be coupled with. So stormwater management is huge. There's currently a study going on nationally to understand how putting solar in a field or at a site can impact the water runoff as rain hits the panels, and then creating design principles to help channel the flow such that it's going in the most beneficial direction. And similarly, if you place a solar farm with this vegetative cover with different plant covers, you can have, if placed, for example, between a water body and a land use that might historically result in nutrient runoff. So often conventional agriculture is used as an example. There are obviously others, but putting the solar with the beneficial habitat and vegetation underneath can act as sort of this buffer to filter out nutrients, provide sequestration, and make it so that the water body is protected. And obviously that's going to have impact for drinking water as well. You see opportunity to restore soil health. And so if you have perennial vegetative cover, you are helping return soil organic carbon to the soil. You're creating a more robust soil ecosystem, and that's obviously going to have environmental benefit, as well as carbon sequestration from those plants on the soil, as well as the sequestration in the soil itself. And finally, there's a tremendous opportunity for integration of solar with agriculture. So a growing movement of agrovoltaics, which is planting crops, food crops directly underneath the panels. It's most often going to be your vegetables or fruits, things that you would manually pick by hand. But they love being under the panels in a really exciting, mutually beneficial way, because as the plants grow, they provide a cooling effect to the panels. The panels actually operate more efficiently when it's cold or cooler. And so it's increasing the efficiency of the energy production during the day. And then it's also providing some cooling shade to plants that many species prefer and will grow more robustly with the addition of that shade. There's also integration with livestock, so soil grazing and crop diversification. So increasingly agricultural producers are seeing solar as a agricultural resource. And so thinking about if you're a very large agricultural producer with thousands of acres and you want to devote a quarter of that to solar, you now have a different revenue stream that can enhance and make more robust and resilient the economic portfolio of your entire agricultural operation. So I threw a list at you really quickly, but a lot of really exciting environmental benefits that can be coupled with solar through the use of environmentally sensitive design. Because I threw such a big list at you, I wanted to group these into maybe more easy to remember categories. So as we think about ESD design practices, there are sort of these three buckets. There are tremendous opportunities for agriculture through that diversified income, the co-location of different production, and pollinator benefits for nearby crops, which I didn't even mention, but obviously the crops are going to appreciate the addition of pollinators who thrive on the native habitat that you've put under the panels. The water quality production bucket, the perennial ground cover is going to reduce that runoff. There's soil benefits, as well as the opportunity for the array or site to act as sort of this vegetated wetland or a buffer to waterways. And then that habitat value, right? So landscaping and vegetation that's going to support your pollinators, small mammals, birds, reptiles, etc. So obviously we want to advocate for continued environmental conservation through local design. I did just want to take a minute and talk about how, and part of the reason that there's been maybe some pushback or these practices aren't as ubiquitous is that you do have to have additional site considerations to implement some of these practices. And so as you're a community considering what type of environmentally sensitive design you'd like to see implemented with solar, you may need to adjust the solar array height. So for example, if you have taller native prairie grasses growing in your panel, you're going to want those higher than if you had shorter wildflower grasses, for example. And I don't claim to be an ecologist. Similarly, fences or barriers. So as that we were describing that industrial model at the beginning, many people have probably seen with their own eyes a solar system that has chain link around it. That's pretty conventional. That's pretty common. But an anecdote that I think is really powerful and speaks to the way that the entire ecosystem needs to be considered in site design is there was a contractor presenting at a solar conference in the Midwest, and he stood up and he asked a question. He said, I've been working on these systems across the Midwest and across Minnesota for the last decade. And for some reason, every time I get to Minnesota, I go to these systems and they're littered with mice. There are mice everywhere. They are causing havoc to the maintenance of the system. They're getting into the inverters, and it's a real pain in the butt. And a pollinator expert stood up and said, well, what fence are you using? And the guy said, chain link, it's common, it's conventional. And he said, well, no wonder you have so much mice. You're keeping all of the small predators out, right? And so I think that's just a beautiful anecdote for how thinking about the system and the ecosystem really holistically through these environmental design principles is going to give you the win-win-wins that we want to see from the way that solar is on the landscape. And the last one here is just screening and setbacks. And so depending on the type of practice that you want to see from the solar, you're going to maybe need to change the distance from, for example, a waterway that you want to remediate runoff into so that it's closer in proximity. So just thinking about where you're placing these things. This is a super helpful little table that the National Renewable Energy Laboratory prepared. I'm not going to walk you through the entire thing. This is going to be made available, but it shows it, for example, how a conventional site might be prepared. So the way that the solar industry has kind of standardized the site design. And then on the right column, a low impact or conservation design alternative, right? And so this is really useful because as we think about building environmental design principles into local planning, that's most often going to happen through zoning or ordinances or through development requirements or review processes. And so this provides specific language that could be advocated for to put into that zoning or ordinance language or the development requirements or review processes. So finally, I know I'm right at the tail end of the time I've been allotted, but I wanted to leave you with 2 calls to action. The first, hopefully you've just been made aware of a lot of opportunities with solar and thinking about how, if designed in a really thoughtful way, you can provide tremendous environmental benefit to the community. And so bring that to the attention of your elected officials, right? You don't know what you don't know. And often folks don't realize that because they've seen solar a certain way for so long with the gravel and the chain link, that's how it has to be. It doesn't. And so letting them know that there are these tremendous opportunities to shift the site design in such a way that you're seeing all of these other benefits. And then secondarily, support efforts to maintain local authority in siting and permitting these projects. And so this is huge, specifically in Indiana, as we think about things like local governments having the opportunity to require pollinator habitat, right? So with regard to that, you're going to want to contact your state rep and state senator. This is the same information you've heard from the other speakers, but specifically share that you support county governments continuing to have the right to enact ordinances that explicitly require environmental friendly or pollinator friendly solar site design. And that can't come with the caveat that there's veto power by private landowners. So making sure that that is communicated, that you voice that you'd love to see this, because if you're a community that wants to get ahead of solar development and you see the opportunity that you can have with environmentally sensitive design, you need to make sure that the power to enact these principles stays in the hands of the community members who ultimately are going to be impacted by the solar development. Thank you. I think I'm it. This will be available. I threw together, for the people who want to dig deeper, a bunch of resources. Notably at the top is the State of Indiana Model Solar Ordinance that just came out last year. It has a lot of these principles brought into example language for what it might look like to put this into local ordinance, put this into local zoning. Really useful guide, Indiana specific. And thank you so much for your time. Like many others, I know we could talk about this for a lot longer than the time allotted. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jesse, for that fantastic, incredibly informative presentation, which covers a topic that we don't quite discuss to the degree that we do for rooftop solar. So I know this will be enlightening. All presentations, by the way, will be posted on our website after the conference at hecweb.org/GTS. And let me bring on board our other two panelists, Ben Inskeep, as well as John Delurey. There we go. And if you could please unmute all of you, and we'll dive into questions for which we have 12 minutes. So actually, I take that back. Let's mute our mics unless we're talking, just because I do see there's a little bit of disturbance there. So the first question is for Ben. We had a couple of people inquire about warehouses and solar. And I guess the question for you, and maybe John, you can also weigh in, is are you aware of kind of any express public policy somewhere in the country that essentially intends to incentivize putting solar on warehouses?
I haven't examined this question in detail, but there are definitely states that have taken steps to encourage solar at these types of places. I know California is one example that comes to mind in terms of being the first state in the nation to have a rooftop solar mandate on new buildings. I think that also includes certain commercial buildings. But I don't know, maybe John or Jesse has additional information, but that's the state that comes to mind in response to that question.
Yeah, I can just jump in real quick. Everything I can point to is more of a carrot than a stick. It's incentives for those like large, low-hanging fruit solar customers to go solar. But I haven't seen anything that would suggest it's a requirement. We are starting to see building codes tighten in a lot of places to the point where they have to be net zero by a certain year. And there's no real way for them to do that without like strong weatherization and energy efficiency upgrades and some form of rooftop solar. But I don't know of any state that has a firm requirement.
Thank you, Ben. And John, we'll move on to the next question here, which we'll pose to John. And that is simply, what is the source of the polling data that you cited?
Yeah, it was all from the Pew Research Center. And the bulk of it was from a 2020 poll. And then one chart was from a more recent poll, I think, from this past summer.
Okay, great. Thank you, John. And kind of a different question, but also related to polling, is Leslie had questioned about the drop in GOP support over time for solar. Do you happen to know what might be factors behind that?
I could take a few educated guesses, but the polling didn't dive deeper, so I can't speak for the however many hundreds of Americans spoke as part of the poll itself. And just to back up, the polling data that I referenced was nationwide. It was not Indiana specific. So just wanted to underline that. My theory is that a lot of it is from the election. There was a pretty steep dive in 2020. That's when that cliff starts to emerge and when there's more of a divergence there. I think partisanship is on the rise. I think discontent is on the rise. And I think a lot of people are being told a lot of things about the infrastructure bill, about Build Back Better, about President Biden's agenda. And I think it's starting to take a toll. I'll also add that, all the benefits that come from locally sited renewables that I mentioned earlier, there are some frustrations that are starting to rise with local opposition around siting and sort of the not in my backyard syndrome, which speaks to Jesse's points too about like responsible siting and ordinances like that.
Thank you, John. Do you want to add anything to that, Jesse, with respect to this issue of how siting controversies are driving political attitudes about solar?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when I speak sort of to the breadth of the Midwest, and what we're seeing is there's such rich solar resource that as the market is and has been approaching so rapidly the point where solar it makes so much sense, we've come to and worked with so many communities who say, well, all this solar just showed up and we didn't know what to do. So there just hadn't been that education piece up front to say, okay, well, we do want solar, right? Is often the actual ethos of the community, but because it happened so quickly, because it happened without their opportunity for input and thoughtful design, it happens in a way that they go, hey, hold on, this isn't the landscape that I want to live in. And often it's going to be, especially as you're citing these really large systems, in more rural communities. So there's fewer people. They, I don't want to assign, a stereotype or a judgment, but maybe change feels scarier, especially as we see, shifting demographics of rural communities across the country already. And so I think our biggest anecdote was, how do we equip communities with accurate information at the onset so that as they're devising their ordinance language, as they're devising zoning, they're doing so in a way that they can still capitalize on the benefit that they can have in their own community, which are those myriad of benefits in addition to the solar generation, without getting to a point where they're scared or fearful of solar coming without their ability to weigh in on it in such a way that you might start to see things like moratoriums or really excessive ordinance or zoning language that makes it impossible or really, really difficult to cite anything at all, despite the fact that we know and have had these conversations to unlock communities do want the benefits that solar can bring. So I think it's teasing out that balance and also putting the information and the power for decision-making into the hands of those local community members and keeping it there.
Thank you, Jesse. Next question will be for Ben, switching over to rooftop solar. Ben, the age-old question that skeptics and opponents of net metering bring up is that they're essentially free riding off of other people who are using the grid. This was a question that was asked to us by text. Can you speak to that, please?
Sure. Yeah, that is a common refrain that we hear from utilities. But I think, it's important to note a couple things. So first of all, one of the great things about distributed solar is its location. It's located right at the site where energy is being consumed, at the point of load, or immediately adjacent to it. In the case that you're, a solar customer and you're putting a little bit of energy on the grid, that's going to flow immediately to your neighbors. In contrast, you have your centralized generation, either utility scale solar or coal plants or natural gas plants. That requires using the full transmission system, the distribution system to then get it actually to where it's needed. So that's a huge benefit. And so I think that's one of the tricks that utilities like to try and not address. They say that we can buy other power for cheaper, but sure, you can buy it at the transmission on a transmission line cheaper, but then you have to transmit it and distribute it to the end use customer. And that's where a lot of the costs are coming. That's where a lot of our bill increases are coming from, is the utilities are spending a lot of money on those things. And so one of the huge benefits of distributed solar is that it reduces the need for those investments and it saves us money through being able to site it right at the point of load.
Thank you, Ben. Next question is for Jesse. Jesse, can you come up with any examples, or do you know of any examples of rainwater recapture on solar farms?
I love that question because I think it highlights sort of, if you can think it's probably achievable. I don't have any specific examples. I can offer a study that is coming out of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory right now to take away from all of this research one single coefficient to say if you have a solar panel, a stormwater runoff coefficient. So if you have a solar panel at this angle and you're expecting this much rain, you can expect this much water to fall off of it. And so I think that there's definitely opportunity to apply that type of information to something like a capture and reuse program or design component. I think it's a fantastic idea.
Super. Thank you, Jesse. Going back, trying to make sure that we're spreading the love in terms of these questions to everybody. John, Michigan and Indiana both have Republican legislatures, and yet they have very different dynamics at the present moment with respect to solar. Is it because there's a different type of Republican that's dominant in Michigan?
That's such a good question. One, it's very insightful that there are different types of Republican, right? Just as we know and have realized acutely over the last couple months, there are different types of Democrats. There are different types of Republicans. And so, it really depends who has the microphone, who holds the reins. And so that Michigan example I used, we have a relatively conservative Republican representing a district in the Upper Peninsula who is supportive of solar and wants to see more solar unlocked. And they may fall in, more in sort of the energy freedom, energy control. Their motivations might be different than some of us, but they're drawn to this as a resource. Whereas the head of that committee feels very beholden to the utility companies and is blocking progress at every possible opportunity. And so even within Michigan, there is a broad spectrum of different types of Republicans. I would only say that Michigan might feel a little different because it's been perhaps more consistently competitive. And there's more of a risk of things switching control, of a chamber going to the Democrats and needing to walk a slightly finer line. It also, it has a Democratic governor. It's voted off and on for a Democratic president. So the people of Michigan may lean a little bit more in the moderate or liberal direction overall. And that does reflect itself into the state house. But Michigan isn't leaps and bounds ahead of Indiana. I'll add that in closing. And so I think there could be some friendly competition between the two states, honestly.
All right. Thank you, John. I'm looking at the clock. We're at 1:29 here, and which means we are really coming to the close of this panel discussion, for which I know there are more questions than we have time to answer. Let me see here. Jesse, could you just very briefly speak to this issue of how do we design ordinances to foster urban-based residential solar clusters, right? I shouldn't even preface it to residential. How do we structure ordinances such that it can foster clusters of solar development in urban areas?
Yeah, and I'll say, others can chime in as well too. I'll also point folks to the Indiana solar model solar ordinance, which has a lot of this really, really helpful information in ordinance jargon, right? But I think more from a high level view, if you want to see effective ordinance and zoning, the first thing I'd say is to make sure that you have community support on board and that any language put into ordinance or zoning has been vetted by the community members. And so a really good example, I know John earlier brought up NIMBYism. And so the not in my backyard, if all of a sudden folks with what they thought was a beautiful view are seeing a solar development go in and they had no idea what was happening until they get the notice that there's something to review, that's too late. And so having ordinance language that allows solar in all zones, that has language that defines how it needs to be screened or the type of setbacks necessary such that community members are going to say, hey, yeah, that's my solar and it's exactly where I want it. I appreciate it, but it's not infringing on the way that I live my life, or am getting benefits from it that outweigh the concern I have about infringement. Sorry, it's got a little long-winded, but point being, the biggest things are allowing solar in all zones, making sure that additional ordinance language is is set by and through community voice. And then also you can encode requirements for things like pollinator habitat, native vegetation, different types of plantings. And so baking that into the ordinance language is going to be one of the most efficient ways to see the benefits that you want around environmentally sensitive design and community, environmental benefit.
Wonderful advice. Thank you, Jesse. We're going to have to wrap it up there. I hope you guys will be able to stick around for just a few more minutes. So if people want to private chat you to answer any lingering questions, that'd be wonderful. The reason why we really have to adjourn now is because we do have a couple of fantastic opportunities for our Green the State House attendees coming up next. Right now, in the sessions area, you'll be able to hear from Tim Maloney, our Senior Policy Director, and Delaney Barber, our Senior Outreach Associate, who will share tips about how to be an effective environmental advocate. It's really suited for people who are just new to advocacy, as well as people who are very seasoned and want to ask some more challenging questions about how to be effective at organizing and talking to lawmakers. In another avenue for engagement is through the expo area, where you can network with both nonprofit and green businesses. We would very much hope you stop by there, because there's just an amazing set of partners there who would love to network with you to find out opportunities for volunteering in the case of nonprofits, and then, being a supporter of one of the green businesses who are producing great goods and services in Indiana that are environmentally sustainable in nature. Finally, there's this option called networking, where you can just hook up, connect with just random people at Green the State House and just simply get to know our audience that way. And actually, I should say there's a fourth option, which is that you can just private message people and have these one-to-one conversations. So I'm truly grateful to you, Ben, Inskeep, John Delurey, and Jesse Wyatt, for your time and your expertise with our panel. And thank you so much, audience, for listening in, and looking forward to your continued engagement. At 2 o'clock, Dr. Indra Frank will be moderating a panel on wetlands. So with that, I will bid you all adieu, and I will see you tomorrow. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.